Ooh, it just asked me for consent. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. You've joined Friends of the St. Clair Rivers Naturalist series on invasive species. I'm Kirsten Lyons, Stewardship Director, and I also have with me Amy Meeker-Taylor, who is our environmental educator. Friends of the St. Clair River is the Blue Water area's largest environmental leader. Our nonprofit consists of a 10-member dedicated board of directors, 3 talented staff, enthusiastic interns, and hundreds of passionate volunteers. In the 13 years we've been here, we have built a respected reputation as the voice protecting and restoring water and land in St. Clair County. We do this through on-the-ground projects, education, and advocacy. We're proud of our partnership through Southeast Michigan and Ontario, and it gives us the upper hand to prioritize clean water and healthy environments. We have a successful track record with community science and place-based stewardship education opportunities and community engagement efforts and volunteer management. We'll share with you today how our experience and technical resources and training are benefiting our community and how you can apply these concepts to your own life. Amy's going to lead the first part of this presentation, and I'll join in again later. Take it away, Amy.
All right, so again, my name is Amy Meeker-Taylor. I am the environmental educator for Friends of the St. Clair River. Just a little bit more about who we are and our mission. So we inspire citizen action through stewardship, monitoring, and education to restore, protect, and enhance the St. Clair River and its watersheds. And our vision is to remain a highly visible champion for St. Clair River watershed programs, issues, research, policies, and partnerships using sound research, respected advocacy, and innovative education. We believe that the St. Clair River and its watersheds should be a thriving ecosystem that is protected to maximize environmental, social, recreational, and economic values and services. So this program today is an introduction to invasive species, and by the end of this 30 minutes, we would like you to know what an invasive species is and why we should care about it. We're going to highlight a few invasive species in Michigan, and we're going to wrap up with what you can do to help stop the spread of invasive species. So what is an invasive species? An invasive species is one that is not native and whose introduction causes harm or is likely to cause harm to Michigan's economy, environment, or human health. So what is a native species? A native species is one that originated and developed in its surrounding habitat and has adapted to living in that particular environment. But are all non-native species invasive? No, and we'll talk more about that later. So just because we have a plant or animal or pathogen that comes from another place and establishes here, it doesn't mean it's going to be invasive, and we're going to talk about what makes something invasive later on. So how do species move? We call these pathways of introduction. Invasive species are always introduced by human activities. So in the absence of human influence, species do move. They expand their range based on natural changes, but that process takes hundreds of thousands of years. When an invasive species is introduced, the species that are already there don't have time to adapt and compete. So yes, species can move on their own, but it's a much slower process than when humans facilitate the movement of species. Intentional introductions include agriculture, aquaculture, horticulture, and the pet trade. So we move different kinds of plants for food. We might move fish to culture them or to farm them to feed people. We might use different landscaping plants in our horticulture, and also the pet trade has been a way of introducing invasive species when people release the things that they no longer want. And unintentional introductions can happen via ballast water in ships, hitchhikers and trade products, and bait buckets. So the example of ballast water in ships, when we have our big freighters that traverse the Great Lakes, when they go across the ocean to pick up things in ports in Europe or Asia, they actually suck water in those ports to help balance the ship when they're crossing the ocean. And then when they get here, they expel that water into the Great Lakes. Now, there's lots of regulations in place, and we're getting closer and closer to having those tight ballast water regulations, telling the ships they have to exchange ballast water out at sea, or they have to disinfect their ballast water before they eject it into the Great Lakes. But a lot of our invasive species got here this way, and they're still being introduced this way. So we can do a lot to control them, but if there's still more coming in, it's not helping the problem. So what makes us introduced species more likely to become invasive? So just because a species is introduced, it does not mean it will become invasive. An invasive species typically have traits that enable them to outcompete others for resources like space, sunlight, and food. They are often fast-growing, habitat generalists, and prolific reproducers, and are usually tolerant of disturbance and stress. So habitat generalist means they can live just about wherever. One example that we like to use is zebra mussels. They can live in water that's fresh. They can live in water that's a little bit salty. They can go back and forth in between. So they don't have very specific habitat requirements. And prolific reproducers just means they can spread faster than our native species because they reproduce so fast. And what makes the Great Lakes more susceptible to invasion? The things that make our lakes great also make them more susceptible to invasion. At least 180 species have been introduced to the Great Lakes since the early 1800s, and the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 accelerated that rate of introduction. So once we had a direct connection to the ocean, from the ocean to the Great Lakes, and trade started picking up, also the introduction of invasive species started picking up as well. Shipping, recreational boating, and fishing all contribute to the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species, and terrestrial invasive species are also moved around by people. And Kirsten's going to talk a little bit more about that. And as a bioregion, the Great Lakes is a relatively young landscape. So geologically speaking, the Great Lakes is very young. The last glaciers retreated about 10,000 years ago and left kind of a barren landscape. So many of our native plant and animal species are very young when you think of in terms on the species level, and they don't have that genetic bank to draw from. So in contrast to that, zebra mussels is a species they think is about 3.5 million years old. And so they have lots more that genetic bank to draw from when they need to quickly adapt to a new environment. So we're going to look at a couple of case studies here. So the first one is zebra mussels. So zebra mussels are a fingernail-sized mollusk that is native to freshwaters in Eurasia. They arrived in the Great Lakes in the 1980s via that ballast water that was just discharged by large ships from Europe. And they have spread rapidly throughout the Great Lakes region and into larger rivers of the eastern Mississippi drainage. And more recently, they've been found as far as Texas, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California. And zebra mussels negatively impact our ecosystems in many ways. They filter out algae that native species need for food, and they attach to and incapacitate our native mussels. And power plants spend millions of dollars removing these zebra mussels from clogged water intakes every year. And this is actually a picture of zebra mussels on my own personal dock at my house. So this is the zebra mussels. And this is about a year's worth of colonization because this was out of the water last year because of the low water and there was nothing on it. So this was about a year of growth. So just a little comparison of zebra mussels versus our native mussels to help understand why the zebra mussels have been so successful here. So with the native mussel, which is the graphic on your left, that's done in like all in blue, our native mussels, when they reproduce, there's a male and a female, and the sperm is released into the water and it has to get to the female mussel. And then the female produces eggs. And once those eggs hatch, she releases her larvae, which are called glochidia. And those glochidia have to attach to the gill of a fish. And they stay on the gill. And some species of mussel have specific fish that they have to attach to. So there's a very specific relationship. Some species of mussel can be any fish. It just depends on the mussel. And they stay on those gills for about 9 months. And then they drop off and they bury themselves in the substrate. And it takes about 5 years for those native mussels to be mature enough to then reproduce on their own. And so if they drop off on the wrong substrate, or if they can't find if the glochidia can't find the fish to attach to, they're not going to have the reproductive success. In contrast to that, the zebra mussels, their larvae are free swimming. So we call them broadcast spawners. So the zebra mussel just releases its larvae into the water. We call them veligers. They're free swimming. They can be like that for about a month. and then they just settle out wherever and they start to grow. And they have these things called byssal threads. You can kind of see them right here, that allows them to settle on just about anything and start to grow. So they don't have to find the right substrate. They can just grow on anything, including each other and including other mussels. All right, and Kirsten's got a little bit more expertise in the gypsy moth, so I'm gonna let her take over from here. Let me give you control here, Kirsten.
Okay, thank you.
You have it?
Hey, looks like I got it.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just going to bring up all of our.
Okay.
Whoop, let me go back. Can I go back? I can go back. Good. Okay. So I'm Kirsten Lyons. I'm Stewardship Director with Friends of the St. Clair River. And I'm going to talk about gypsy moths as like a closer look at an invasive species. They were intentionally brought to the US in 1869 in a misguided attempt to produce silk. Unfortunately, when that idea didn't work out, the caterpillars were released into a nearby forest. And since then, they've been multiplying and wreaking havoc on forested ecosystems as they move from the Northeast region westward across the Great Lakes. Like many invasive species, gypsy moth caterpillars are generalist. They feed on the leaves of a wide diversity of tree and shrub species. And also, like many invasive species, they didn't bring their biological enemies with them from the homeland, and that would have controlled them naturally. They get moved around at every life stage, so egg masses can attach to your RV, and then you drive off to your home in Kansas, and suddenly you have a new infestation of gypsy moth there. The caterpillars can drop down on silken threads from tree limbs or tree leaves. And then blow up to a half a mile if they're small enough and the wind is just right. And then the adult moths can fly. So the caterpillars can defoliate trees or whole forests. Sometimes that leaves them vulnerable to diseases and other pests, which may lead to tree mortality. During large outbreaks, debris and frass from feeding caterpillars can be disruptive to outdoor activities. And many people are suffering from that right now in St. Clair County. Okay, so there's what the caterpillars look like. It took over 100 years, but natural enemies have adapted and increased in abundance to help keep gypsy moth populations largely in check, but outbreaks still occur. That they're intense, they're frightening, they're exhausting to landowners and nature lovers. So our community is currently working on a plan to mitigate this issue. And please keep in touch with us to learn more about how this infestation is unfolding and how we plan to move forward. So what's next in invasive species? Well, the invasive species management process involves a few key steps. Before managing anything though, we need to make the time to correctly identify and learn all we can about not only that invasive species, but also the native species and the habitats that are impacted. Then we decide what we want to accomplish before we undertake our management actions. We use SMART goals to help us focus our efforts on what's most important. And SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. In the for our current gypsy moth infestation, for instance, our goals might include reducing the number of caterpillars to tolerable levels for humans, and we might prioritize reducing the stress of the outbreak on individual valued trees or habitats. Before we implement any management actions, we look at the bigger picture of integrated pest management, and we consider how we will intervene or not to affect the pest itself, the host, and the environment, and we use all available tools. Once we have a management plan, we perform our control activities, An example of this for gypsy moth might be an aerial spray, and that'll help reduce the amount of feeding, amount of caterpillars. Then we monitor to see how things are going. It's really important to document our work, and that can be photos, a notebook, smartphone apps, other tools, and some combination. That documentation allows us to see our progress on this management activity over time. We incorporate our lessons learned along the way, and we plan and adjust our next management actions accordingly. So Amy's very important question is eradication possible? And once in a while, it is, but it's pretty rare. Mostly we're talking about invasive species management. The prevention of new introductions is key, and that's the lower left of this invasion curve diagram. It's our best defense against invasive species. And this is a big reason why state agencies, invasive species managers, and volunteer naturalists like you spend so much time and effort on learning and sharing. It is much cheaper and easier to deal with the species you don't even have yet or have in very small numbers. We don't know which exotic species might become invasive given the right conditions and enough time, and that's why we just try to prevent all introductions. Once a new exotic species finds that fertile ground and gets established, it could reproduce rapidly to outcompete or stress native species, overtaking whole yards and ecosystems if left unchecked. So eradication is most often not feasible. Most people do not even notice invasions until it's far too late for eradication, and even containment might be very limited. Think about how long it took us to realize that Phragmites was invasive. Now you see it everywhere, right? So unfortunately, very few people are trained to recognize native plant and animal species, let alone invasive ones. Stick with us and we'll teach you about both, probably more than you wanted to know. So this invasion curve is used a lot in invasive species management and outreach, and I want to show you the other half of this curve. But I want to also mention that as with many disciplines, there are a lot of abbreviations, jargon, and acronyms in invasive species management. And if I use any, I apologize. And you should call me out on it. The language is often negative, as in bad species, good species. Friends has been evolving how we discuss invasive species to be more scientific and neutral in our outreach and our conversations. Instead of saying garlic mustard is bad, for instance, we say we remove it in high quality natural areas to protect and restore them. The invasion curve is one of the most commonly used graphics, but it's very one-sided. So here I'm showing you the other half of that curve where natural enemies, which may be native, biocontrols, or introduced species have begun to have an impact. Invasive species populations may also be reduced by our management actions, by competition, by disturbance, or stress. For the most part, gypsy moth is naturalized in our region. We may never be rid of it, but our ecosystems have rebalanced and developed resistance to its worst impacts. We do still manage invasive species, including gypsy moth, even when they're on this half of the curve, but it may be for human health or quality of life or to protect very high quality natural ecosystems. So how can you help in invasive species management? Well, do your part to manage invasive species on your own and avoid new introductions. Learning and sharing your knowledge is really helpful. Consider joining us at one of our field events or programs. Those all include opportunities to learn about native plants and animals and local ecosystems, as well as invasive species. We'll teach you about nature interpretation. We'll teach you about monitoring and management tactics that we use in our restoration and stewardship of natural areas and green infrastructure. And we'll teach you about what we look for when we're assessing and managing for watershed health. there's a lag time between the time I click. There we go, and the slide changes. So get involved with us. Subscribe to the Friends of the St. Clair River and the Lake St. Clair Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area newsletters, and we'll send links for those out to all participants. Find us on social. Check out our upcoming events on our scriver.org/events page. Better yet, come to one. You can request our services by emailing us. We're going to put our emails back up on the presentation again in just a minute. Become a volunteer steward or a naturalist with us. You can make a donation. You can tell your friends about Friends and SISMA, Cooperative Invasive Species Management Areas, and most importantly, tell your friends about invasive species. I think it's not going to change. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So thanks so much for your time and your attention. So I think we can